Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us on the Unmaking Network. Before we start our interview today with Claire Bartleman, I would just like to personally acknowledge that I am an uninvited guest who lives, works, plays, and studies on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, which include the Ottawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi nations, collectively known as the Three Fires Confederacy. I would also like to acknowledge that my research into unmaking as a creative act was inspired by many scholarly writings about how global economic systems of extraction, production, dissemination, and discard are today's colonizing forces that lead to ecological and therefore cultural genocide both at home and abroad. Secondly, I would like to thank the Social Studies Humanities Research Council of Canada for support of my research in unmaking, and the McLaren Art Center, who so generously supported the series of online artist interviews through the use of their Zoom account. For those of you who are just turning into the Unmaking Network and my research for the first time, unmaking, as written here, with a slash between its prefix and its root, is to be considered an adaptive and generative method that uptakes slow, gentle, collaborative, and timely acts of deconstruction or dismantling in order to create something else of value or use. Also making reference to the UN, United Nations, and their 17 global goals for sustainability, I'm working to expand the definition of unmaking and co-build an unmaking dictionary and methodology so that the word becomes synonymous with repair, restore, resist, refrain, refuse, relinquish, and reimagine. So before we get started, I'd just like to thank Claire for joining us today. Hello, Claire. Good morning.
Morning.
And I'll just start with a brief introduction to Claire's work, which I first had the opportunity to witness as part of an exhibition in Toronto, Ontario, in a show entitled Unmade, held at the Propeller Art Center in 2019. So Claire Bartleman is an Ontario-based artist and educator who holds an MFA in studio art and an MA in art history and curatorial studies from Western University. Bartleman's textile and sculptural-based practice focuses on sentimentality and the personal objects that we hold onto regardless of their practical utility. Embracing the history of the altered ready-made, Bartleman has previously worked with unfinished and abandoned craft projects and is currently creating soft sculptures from worn wedding dresses. A sessional instructor at OCAD University, Bartleman has also worked as an educator at the Art Gallery of Ontario and with Workman Arts. Her lived experience with mental health contextualizes her commitment to decolonization, equity, and access in education. And Bartleman has been shown in Toronto, Montreal, Calgary, and London, Ontario, with exhibitions at X-Space, MKG 127, and Truck Contemporary. She's also the owner and operator of Lilliput Gallery, a tiny exhibition space in an Anne of Green Gables replica dollhouse, which I absolutely adore. And I'm actually interviewing another artist named Amy Oliver, who has a series of dollhouses out of the UK. And so I love the connection between both of your work. So let's get started with your first question. And thank you again for taking time out of your busy schedule of teaching and making.
No, I'm pleased. I'm happy to join.
So as said earlier in my introduction to you, I first entitled your work at Propeller Art Gallery in a show entitled Unmade, in which you submitted a work entitled Did Grandma Make This? Which I believe was a pulled apart and abandoned painting, which you carefully wound into a cotton ball of thread. Can you share with us how and why you first began to work with the abandoned as part of your practice?
Yeah, It's interesting. There's actually three sort of like connected pieces that were in that show, all from one painting. And I actually started doing this in my undergrad. You know, as a lot of students, you know, I didn't have tons of money, and I was actually working in drawing and painting at the time. And my partner was out one day and happened across some garbage, and there was this giant painting, and he thought, oh, Claire could use this stretcher. So like, it's like a way to like bring it home. She can take the painting off and, you know, restretch it to make one of her own paintings. And the painting itself on it was so horrific in like the best way possible. It was this like alien-like person with a giant erection in these like weird peach and greens. And I was like, I just couldn't not do something with it. I just felt like I couldn't just let this go. And because it just made me laugh, and it was like so strange. And so I started taking it apart. And I just started like pulling it apart thread by thread. And as I took it apart, these chunks of paint would stay on it. And I ended up making three works out of it. One I wove back together into sort of a large wall hanging kind of piece. And that's actually the one that's titled Did Grandma Make This? And I titled it based on something that a art award critic said to me that work looks like something that a grandma would make and put over the back of a chair in like a very derogatory way. So I thought that was quite interesting.
Yes.
And then I wound it around into like this ball, and then into this sort of around another object that was a found object. So that's really where I kind of started working with these sort of found objects. And then I moved on to different things as my practice grew.
And I also really think it's an interesting way to extend our understanding of painting. Where
Absolutely.
were you paint, you know, the question is, were you working with textile or were you painting? Because it was a painting that you're deconstructing. And I really love that sort of crossover or a blurriness in terms of discipline, as well as, you know, that derogatory statement. You know, when we think of the skill and knowledge that's required in craft. And so I like that you're blurring the lines between craft and art as well. So that's really interesting. So what did you learn from deconstructing or taking up these abandoned or partially completed craft items?
Well, and you actually just kind of pointed it to it. So when I first started, it really was this question about materials, this question of the division of disciplines. What is painting? What is craft? You know, when is something become one or the other? Why do we have these divisions? Do we need these divisions? And so that's really, you know, thinking through the materiality of things. Do you need to apply the paint to make a painting? So those kinds of things. So that's really where I started. And then when I went to grad school is when I started working with these abandoned craft projects. So these projects that generally women, I think it was almost all women who gave them to me, that they had started, you know, blankets, you know, the one sock syndrome. They made one sock and never made the other. You know, sweater, like there's a whole range of things, cross stitch projects, just a whole range of craft projects that people had started but never finished. And yet they held on to them. And I was so fascinated with this idea that people kept holding on to them. And it started with me, a project that I had started with my mom a long time ago. I'd started knitting an Afghan, and I had like 5 squares, and it was like of like 30 or something. And I was like, am I ever really going to finish this? Why am I holding on to these if I'm never going to finish it? But I couldn't let go of them. And so like originally, as I started working through my master's and thinking about these objects, I was really, you know, thinking about this like idea of like celebrating these objects that people had put time into, of uncovering them. A lot of them also had been passed on. So like someone had like a mother or a grandmother had started something and passed away, and then, you know, a daughter or granddaughter ended up with these objects. And so I kind of wanted to just display them, to monumentalize them a little bit. I kind of was building them into like big objects, and do that sort of thing that a lot of women have been doing since the 70s is, you know, monumentalize and celebrate these skills that are often unacknowledged or undervalued, especially since they've been just kind of hidden in cupboards, right? And so I was learning about making outside the art world, you know, all these people who were making things outside the art world, and also learning about my own history of making and how I came to making, how I came to be an artist, which was through craft. It was through sewing, it was through knitting, it was through cross stitch, it was through collage, those kinds of things. And then I started to think about sentimentality. And that's where I really like sentimentality of these objects. So I was learning about, you know, how sentimentality exists in the world, what it means, why we're sentimental about certain things. And, you know, in a master's context, you know, you kind of go towards theory. So I was learning about affect. I was learning about femage, which is like this history of reclaiming collage. I was thinking a lot about
I'm sorry, can you say that word again?
Femage. So it's
femage.
Femage, F-E-M-M-A-G.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and it's Miriam Shapiro and I'm not going to remember the other artist. I have it later. I can pull it out.
Shapiro?
Miriam Shapiro wrote an article here. Miriam Shapiro and Melissa Meyer.
Okay.
It's a second wave feminist text. It's called Waste Not, Want Not, an inquiry into what women saved and assembled, femage. And it really, it's like a reclaiming of collage as a women's, as women invented, like before Picasso, before Braque, like before collage became a thing within the art world, women were doing it in like as Valentines, they were doing it in their own personal notebooks, they were doing it as personal craft. And so it really comes from a craft-based history as opposed to an art-based history.
Interesting. Great.
Yeah.
Can I add femage to my unmaking dictionary?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
I will cite you as citing them.
No, cite them. They're the ones who deserve it. So
that's awesome. That's great. Did you have any more to comment on that?
Yeah, in terms of learning, no, that's all good. I was just, as I moved into working with wedding dresses, you know, sentimentality is the through line, but there's like another layer when it comes to these wedding dresses. You know, there's that question of femininity continues. What does it mean? What does femininity mean? What does it mean to have something that's feminine versus masculine? Gender norms and expectations, the connection to capitalism and patriarchy, and love. And so these are all things I'm still learning about as I unmake or remake or with these objects.
Right. Yeah, the wedding dress is a pretty powerful icon, you know, or object. So it's heavy, not just in material, but in its meaning. So it's a big one to take on.
Yeah.
So what do you feel like you are helping to unmake when you work with existing objects and relinquish craft projects? Which, you know, when we think, I'm specifically coming from an environmental point of view, but have you thought about that or think about something else when you take up these things that already exist?
Definitely. And I think originally, when I started doing this, even back to working with paintings and like reweaving them and that, I was very interested in the idea that feelings are not allowed in the art world. I studied art history first before I went to art school in like the late 90s, early 2000s. And then even in the like the aughts when I was in art school, you know, everything was about ideas. It was about what does art mean and what are people thinking about and the theories behind it. And it had to be like critically based. It had to make someone think. And so, you know, I was trying to unmake this emphasis of ideas. I'm not sure I achieved it, but that's where I was kind of thinking about. And so I was thinking, and it's kind of ironic because I think I turned to ideas to try and unmake them instead of just focusing on the material and the making, right? So I was thinking about like affect and the affective turn and this idea that like, you know, that we can like validate emotions as and feelings as subjects of academic inquiry, right? Like that we can look at them and include them in our discourse. And so, you know, taking these, like, again, traditionally feminine things, these things that are sentimental, and placing them, like monumentalizing them, placing them out there to say, no, we can just feel them. This idea too of autotopography, which is the idea that objects hold like meaning just in them. And this idea that like this object that someone has given me is like they're giving me their narrative, their story, their history, and it comes with that object. And so it just, yeah, this idea that those feelings are already in the material itself. Yeah, and then I was thinking about, I mean, yeah, the feminine, the domestic commodification of objects. So sort of unmaking that a little bit.
Yeah,
you know,
is there
and
any
yeah.
pictures that you want to share to give us example? Because, you know, when you're working with these, you don't necessarily complete them the way they're intended. And
Yeah,
so
no.
I'd love to see how you and made their initial design
Sure.
intent, or yeah.
Yeah, just share my screen here. And so I'll actually just show these first. These are the three that were in the show that we were first talking about at the start here. So these are the paintings the painting that I made and then re-wove back together. And then here's that ball of thread, and then that third object. But in terms of the craft objects that I'm unmaking, this is sort of the large scale one. This I call Mother Heap. And it is the collection of many unmade projects or unfinished projects. And really here, I wanted to make it larger than life. I wanted to make it feel sort of human, as if it's like growing and can continue to grow. I didn't make a lot of changes to them, to the objects. I literally was just kind of putting them together. And I crocheted them together with this bronze thread, which is a kind of a sparkly bronze thread. And I was thinking about, I was referencing just like very lightly kintsugi, that idea of when pottery gets broken, there's a traditional craft of mending it through gold. And so I was trying to just take this like really light way of just saying like, here's this like other material that I am introducing, that I just want to make that like connection between them obvious, and maybe somewhat special.
I love that you've shared that with us, because now that you've said it, I can see the visual connection between that pottery work and this work. And yeah, so that's really neat to learn that. Thank you.
Yeah. And it's the thing I love about Mother Heap is how far some of these projects went. Like there are blankets in there that are almost done that like just need a border, or right, and they've just been then passed up. And so or sweaters that just aren't quite. And then there's some that it's like one small thing that someone started and was like, nope. And so there's this like this tension between those two objects.
Yeah.
And I'll show you a couple of other ones that I've taken in very different directions. A lot of my work references the body. And I'll talk a little bit about that later, in terms of how I've started to think about unmaking as a working towards bodily autonomy, particularly with my wedding dresses. I wasn't thinking about that when I was working on these, but the body was always there. And this was a jacket that someone had started, a velvet jacket that someone had started and never finished. And so I stuffed it and, laid it on the floor. And to me, it's incredibly vaginal in its imagery. Again, pointing towards the feminine as an object. Here's this sheepskin rug that someone had never brushed out. I left it mostly as is. I started to brush it out. And then there's these little quilt pieces that I built into a small little character that you can see here. And again, I referenced this on this quilt, and this quilt actually was made, same sort of character reference, but was made by a woman whose sister was dying of breast cancer.
Oh.
And she just couldn't complete it. Her sister passed away, and she felt like it just it was too much for her, but she couldn't get rid of it, and so she passed it on to me. And I thought that was like one of the things I'm thinking a lot about, through this, is this idea of craft through community, of this idea of love through making, and these things that we don't necessarily value in the art world, but we value very much in the craft world. And quilting is one of those things that we do with each other and for each other. And these ideas of making objects to give to someone, to gift to someone, and then to use in like a daily way.
Mm-hmm. Well, and what a gift for that person to pass this on to you. Like there's, and trust in you to take care of that, you know, the small remnants that were completed, and trusting you to carry that forward in a respectful way. So that's a real gift as well.
And slightly intimidating as well. And I feel the same way sometimes with the wedding dresses. You know, can I do it justice? Will will these objects become something more, or am I actually taking away from them by unmaking them? Or remaking them?
Right. And I get that, but I think that's important. You know, I think it's important to value materials, and even if we don't necessarily value their existing form, understanding and valuing that initial labor or knowledge or skill or materials that went into that, and carrying it forward in a good way is important, because I think it'll push us to value raw materials further. So yeah, I completely respect that.
And with wedding dresses, that labor that is done isn't valued. It's the designer that's valued, and often designers are men. Mm-hmm. The laborers are often women. They're often women of color. They're often women in other countries who are doing that, like sequin work or bead work or lace work. And the other interesting thing with wedding dresses in terms of value is that idea that it loses monetary value but gains sentimental value. And so when someone buys it, it's like a car. Like as soon as it leaves the store, it like depreciates in like monetary value immediately. But also it gains all these other things. Mm-hmm. And yet what it gains also represents some troubling things. Right? It represents patriarchy, it represents ownership, it represents virtue, as well as representing love and, starting a family and a connection. And so it's like these tensions in what that one object itself represents is so interesting to me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really loaded the wedding dress. So when working with pre-existing materials and forms, is there anything you have had to unmake about yourself and the way you thought about art and your role as an artist?
Yeah, it's interesting to work with objects that people already see as beautiful. Right. So like I feel like I'm starting with like a cheat code or something, like it's people already like I could just put it up that like as is and people be like, whoa, right? Because they're amazing objects. They're these beautiful, like intricately made, amazing objects. And yet at the same time, they're kind of mundane and repetitious and all the same. So it's like there's like a weird dichotomy there too. And I mean, I think it makes me sort of question about my own embedded notions of like femininity and masculinity. Why am I so drawn to these objects myself? Why do I love looking at them? Like, why do I enjoy watching Say Yes to the Dress, to look at these pretty objects, right? Like what is, as someone who isn't married, doesn't really want to have a wedding in any way, shape, or form, why am I still drawn to that? Where's that embedded in me? How was that taught to me by society, right? Those kinds of things. I don't know that it necessarily makes me question my role as the artist, but more so why am I deemed the artist, but the ones who make the original dress aren't. We just talked about that a little bit. The people who are laboring in it, the craft women, often craftsmen, why aren't they considered artists as well? And so I think, yeah, that's sort of what I've been thinking about with that.
Mm-hmm. And we often, well, not we, I should say, some of us often speak to how labor isn't valued in other industries. Really, the labor of artists isn't valued either, right? We get paid to show, we get paid if something sells, we get paid to teach, but we don't get paid to think, or those numerous amounts of hours that goes into conceptualizing and creating something. And so, in fact, we are one of those underappreciated creators.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting though, because I think it depends on what we consider valued. And I think that, in terms of compensation, like actual living wage, like absolutely not. And even in teaching art, not either. But I actually do think that skill within art in the public realm is still very much valued, way more than thinking or conceptualizing or other kinds of less seen. So, I've been having this conversation with my dad for years, and it took a very long time for him to shift. But for him, good art, valuable art, was skilled art, was art that looks like, a painting that looks like has high realism, right? Or a drawing that is like really well rendered. And it's because they can see skill and time.
Right.
And that to me is still valued within the public realm. People, if you do something meticulous and small and over, and people are like, whoa. But if it's, a more conceptual piece, it's still not as valued, which is, I think, why, that's still a discussion within the art world.
Yeah. Some of us, particularly me, would argue that that's the craftsmanship behind the art. And so craftsmanship in that regard is valued. Yeah. Huge discussion we could open up there.
Yeah.
So by limiting yourself to found objects, do you think it hinders or helps creative thinking?
100% helps. Yeah, 100%. Absolutely. And I mean, I see this in teaching too. The moment you put a limit or a constraint on assignments, the more students want to push against it, and the more creative they have to be to push those, that square out into a bubble or a circle. And I think I said, I was talking before about this idea that these found objects come with lived history, right? They come with meaning, they come with a narrative that makes the objects feel alive. And so that ability to respond to that aliveness that's already there, I think makes me, it only enhances my creativity. And I'm going to do a quote here. So the artist is Sayaka Gans. And it's from the book Raw Plus Material Equals Art, which is like a whole book about, you might have come across it, about reusing materials in art. And she says, the difference between molding your own forms and working with pre-existing forms is that the former artist is acting, deciding what the materials do, and the latter artist is reacting to the objects, the form they provide, the physical limitations. And so I think that reaction, and that allowing yourself to create a dialogue with those objects just pushes my creativity and allows me to broaden the way I think about objects and materials.
Yeah, and I think that's a really, some people consider the word unmaking to be negative. And so I like that you've introduced this word reaction, and that it's a collaboration. I absolutely try to acknowledge that when I am unmaking something and remaking something, which is typically always starting from my own work anyway, but when I do start from someone else's work. I try to cite them because they absolutely have informed what I can do and can't do in moving forward, or what I choose to do and not do moving forward. So I like that term reaction. Yeah, thank you for that. So if as artists we choose to recognize how the visual arts contribute to or perpetuate the Anthropocene, which I'm working from Natalie Lovelace's definition, which the Anthropocene is a capitalist, industrial, patriarchal, and colonial thing, a phenomena, if you will. How do you see your practice in relation to the concept of unmaking or undoing these different phenomena and their contribution to the Anthropocene? I know this is a huge question. I am so sorry. I should have broke it down. But do you use your teaching or your art as an opportunity to encourage others to work with existing materials?
Yeah, I think if I were to be really honest, I think my work, particularly with wedding dresses, dances around the idea of unmaking capitalist, industrial, and patriarchal perspectives. I mean, as you said, the wedding dress comes loaded with those in it. And so it's almost impossible in taking that wedding dress apart literally to not start to think about that. I'm not sure it takes a strong stand on it, even though it's in there. And even though I feel I feel a strong stand about those things. I feel strongly about the capitalist wedding, like the wedding industrial complex. I feel strongly about the history of weddings and what they mean, and this idea of like giving someone away, this idea of wearing white and what that symbolizes. But at the same time, I'm not sure I have the right to put that on everybody else. So I'm happy to like note that as a conversation, to introduce that dialogue, but not to push it and to say, well, like, this is right. This is the right way to think. And I think as I said, there's actually probably one moment that really made me question this and made me question my own thoughts on it. And this idea of unmaking these big perspectives, right? And it's what got me started thinking about bodily autonomy. And so what it was I had this moment where I was asking people about wedding dresses. I was asking them, like, do you have one? Would you be willing to pass it on? And I had someone say no to me. Like, I can't give it away. Like, this is mine and I have to keep this. And I asked why. And she sent me a message, and she explained to me that her wedding dress makes her feel empowered. And it makes her feel empowered because she has sort of a conflicting relationship with her body that was passed on to her from her mom. Her mom thought she should buy this really plain sheath wedding dress that like kind of hid her body. And she was like, forget that. Like, I want something big and floofy, and something that makes me feel pretty, and something that makes me feel elegant. And so she bought this dress sort of against her mother's wishes, against her knowledge or consent, which is interesting to me in and of itself, that you feel like you need your mother's consent to buy something that is for you. But she says she talks about it for her, and that the dress made her feel beautiful. And she described it as being like armor. And having a secureness, which I thought was absolutely fascinating. And that it
independence from the sound of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And invincible. And she talked about how it was more expensive than her car. It was the most expensive thing she'd ever bought. Right. And so I thought, well, who am I to say that wedding dress can't do that for you? Yeah. Right? Like, to say that it can't make you feel powerful, that it can't make you feel secure, that it can't be that thing that you think back to say, no, I am in control of my own life. And so despite all these reservations I have about the relationship of this object to capitalism, to patriarchy, I'm wary of being too strong about it, and not allowing a dialogue, and not allowing it to be a discussion, and to have people come in and feel like to see my work and not feel guilty about wanting to have a wedding dress. And so that's where I've been thinking a lot about this question of bodily autonomy, and that it's their choice. Like, they have the right to put whatever they want on them, and no one can say otherwise. It still makes me question why women don't feel empowered in their body in the first place, and they need this object to do that. But I want that to be a dialogue as opposed to like a pure political statement, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Just to touch back on the part of the question where I asked you if you encourage your students to use secondhand objects. I wonder if you do that. It just that I'm very wary in that I've gone through the whole system, that for many years you're kind of given kits.
Yeah.
And so I wonder if you've found room to encourage this sort of play with things that already exist.
Yeah, I've gotten rid of any kits. I require as few materials as possible. So I ask students to use what they have most of the time. I struggle with it sometimes because I think that there's opportunity. Using new materials can, and I don't necessarily mean new in terms of in terms of like buying it new, just like new to you, like something you've never explored before, can open doors. But I think that this requirement of all these materials that you, again, sort of like a wedding dress, you use once. I teach students in a drawing class that are like going into photography, and I'm like, I'm not going to go and make them buy all of these drawing materials just so that they use it once and then never use it again. It's such a waste on so many levels, and I don't know that it is that the opportunity to try it is that, like, I think we can expand their brain and opportunity to try and explore and play in other ways. You can explore with a pen that you already had and a notebook that you never finished. So I try really hard to make it accessible. And I think it's also about accessibility. This question of, the cost of art school can be unreal when you start to talk about materials, and the less that they need to use, I think the better. So really it's a broader perspective. I don't know that I do it in like a very specific assignment perspective. That said, my assignments are always like open, like it's whatever you want to use. I'm never like there's never like you have to use this material and this size and this, right? Oh,
that's good, right? Because it's more likely that the work will reflect that individual, right? We're not asking them to all create an 8x10 drawing created with a 2B, 4B, and 6B pencil, to demonstrate their knowledge of graphite and its density or softness or whatever. So, you're much more likely to end up with something that reflects the person creating it that way.
Yeah, and we talk a lot about materials and what they mean. I think that's the thing is we often in art school think of materials as neutral, and as you know through this, they're not neutral. And that we, the example I often use, students want to make a work about environmentalism or climate change, and they make an acrylic painting.
Yes.
and you're like,
or an oil paint,
right? And so it's like, and maybe that is the right choice, but you need to recognize what that material means, from like a starting point, and not an afterthought.
Right. Yeah, you need to understand that the choices you're making are either contributing to or combating. And that these materials have their own histories. In fact, I don't know if there's, I haven't seen a whole lot of material histories courses in undergrad. And I do feel like that's something we could not only return to in terms of understanding our choices, but there's so much wonderful innovation happening around arriving at new materials created from waste that I think students would, have a blast with.
Yeah,
become
absolutely.
inventors again. Okay, so where are we? So, you talked about capitalism and your concern, not your concern, but understanding how capitalism is often already embedded within objects that we're using, obviously, because we're makers, producers, consumers, and discarders. But if we think about specifically art and how the majority of society expects artists to produce beautiful images and collectible things for consumption, that ultimately uphold our existing understanding of what constitutes good art, right? Like they like things that demonstrate skill and reflect back to them what they might already know. So what else needs to be unmade if artists are to resist and break free from these sort of hegemonic systems and aesthetics that limit access and ultimately cultural transformation? Like, how do we help everyone move beyond this sort of capitalist understanding of consumption and ownership and accumulation, I guess?
It's a really good question. I'm going to share my screen again to show you some of the wedding dress work that I've done. And the reason I want to show it is because I'm not sure I'm not contributing to this. I'm still making art looking objects, right? And not even objects that are necessarily it's not even about saleable, but like that someone could have in their home, right? That someone could enjoy, that someone could live with and have a daily conversation with. Like these are gallery objects. And so I struggle with that a little bit, and I question this, and it's actually something I've been questioning for a really long time since I went to art school. Really started making art. Is like, what is the point of all this? Like, why am I making, right? And it feels very selfish because it feels like it's for me to work through all these ideas. And so, when I'm making these things that I do want to share and do want to have these conversations and dialogue with, I'm like, but I'm still just making stuff that exists in the world. Yeah, I'm taking them out of a box from someone else's closet so people can see it, but now it's back in a box in my closet, right? So it's kind of I feel conflicted about it. But if I, sorry, I'll unshare here. Stop sharing.
Oh, you can leave them up if you like.
I think the thing, truthfully, that I think needs to be unmade in the art world is this notion of art itself, and it not being object based, even though that's what I'm doing. So it's like, this is like what I believe and what I do are perhaps two different things. And this is where I feel conflicted. But I have this tote bag that says feelings can be art. And I think this is where I really want our understanding of art to be, that it's not about stuff or things. It's about the feelings or the conversations, the feelings of love, of community, of care, of family. And this is perhaps why craft is so fascinating to me, because that's often what it is. And it's like, I sound like weirdly like from the 90s and like about relational aesthetics, right? Like that this is what the art is, and where art, needs to be unmade too. Yet I still make objects because there's something for me about making that feels important, yet I can't describe why.
Well, I think it's about connecting, because ultimately, 99.9% of the world still that understands that that's what art is. And so, if we didn't produce objects, we might not be able to reach, even that, the small percentage that we do. And so I do think it is about connecting with others, and we're so drawn, everybody's so drawn and attached to the visual. But I get it. I get what you're saying, because often people don't even care that you're using secondhand items. you're putting stuff out into the world, and they don't understand the importance of the process or of the sourcing, or all of that you've been thinking about. They don't, they often just consume that which is the visual outcome of all of that. And so, yeah, I hear you, and I'm just like, okay, how do we begin to value all of that which is behind the scenes, and how does that become, how do we get remunerated for that, right? Because I think artists would be much more likely to take on those wonderful facilitations of relational aesthetics and community building, and if more politicians and funding bodies would acknowledge that type of work. But I also think that's directly connected to what the public, I don't think none of us are separate. I think we're all intertwined in the system of expectations. And
it's also a little bit of a vicious circle when you make, like, I struggle to want to make things that actually are saleable.
Yeah.
Because it does perpetuate that idea that the only things that are valuable in art is how much it's worth, monetarily. And I don't want to have to put a number. I don't want, like, if somebody wanted one of my pieces, I'd probably be like, take it, because like, I'd rather
don't say that out loud. I'm gonna edit that out.
I want people to want to live with them and have conversations with them. And so I struggle with that idea. It just becomes a vicious circle.
Right. Yeah. All right, we're going to end with that big sort of mic drop question for today. But this has been really enjoyable, and thank you again. So what do you feel needs more unmaking in the world, or more specifically the art world today?
I think competition. I think the art world is about winners and losers, about art stars, about prizes, big expensive shows. It's about who's an expert, what I'm good at versus what you're good at. It's about resume building and getting ahead. And I really want it to be about sharing, learning, caring through making, the experience of making, process. I think that all of the money part of the art world is what I want to be unmade. And I think about my students, and I want them to come to art school not to become the next medal winner or to get good grades, which is another form of value and pain, or to become the next, art star, but I want them to learn and grow and think and question. And I want it to be about feelings.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And have you thought much about something that could help unmake, like something that could be introduced that could help unmake that sort of competition or money drive, or things that can determine our value? Have you thought of something?
Within the art world, not so much. Within teaching, absolutely. And it's the idea of ungrading. Okay. And this idea of shifting our value set towards grades, and thinking about it more in terms of dialogue, in terms of reflection, learning, in terms of working together to build a community within a classroom.
Right. And and ultimately that's where it all needs to start, is in the education system, right? If our education system doesn't model it, it won't get carried through into the after worlds that come, in terms of working together and sharing and feeling. So, well, this has been wonderful. I've heard some great references, books and authors that I'll be sure to pull out for our listeners and readers. And thank you for sharing your amazing imagery and work with the audiences for the Unmaking Network. And I guess we'll once again thank the McLaren Arts Center and SSHRC and Queen's University for their support of the research into unmaking. And we will say goodbye. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a really nice conversation.